The Man Who Refused Silence. Detroit, Michigan, 1981. There are cities that the world abandons, and there are men who refuse to let them die. Detroit, Michigan, November 1981. This winter, the average temperature was -6 degrees. The unemployment rate had reached 28%. More than 300,000 families had lost their income in the last 5 years. The industrial heartland of America was grinding to a halt. In the silence that settles when an era ends, when promises harden and crack like old concrete, some men and women found an opportunity. Not to help, to steal. A man saw what was happening, and he decided that someone needed to know. The man who refused silence. The city that never forgets. To understand what James Whitmore did, one must first understand where he was. Not just geographically, but historically. For decades, Detroit had been the beating heart of the greatest economy of the 20th century. When the automobile factories were operating at full capacity, each car that rolled off the assembly lines was a fulfilled promise. The promise that honest work, repeated day after day, was worth something. That there was a future waiting on the other side of the production line. That promise had a name. It was called Motor City. And it had attracted entire generations. Black families from the South fleeing segregation, Polish and Hungarian immigrants, and Mexicans who traded the misery of their countries for the honest hardship of an assembly line. They came. They stayed. They built. Then the promise was broken. Competition from cheaper and more reliable Japanese cars. The oil shock that increased production costs. Misguided management decisions that prioritized immediate profit over long-term investment. And beneath it all, something harder to name. The arrogance of an industry that had dominated long enough to believe it would dominate forever. In 1981, Detroit had the highest unemployment rate among major American cities. Neighborhoods that had been built by proud workers were falling apart. Schools lacked supplies. Hospitals lacked equipment. Streets were poorly maintained. And a city government that, as the world would soon discover, had the money for all of that, as long as that money went into the right pockets. James Earl Whitmore was born in that city in 1929. He was the son of a janitor and a primary school teacher who, in her 32-year career, never took a vacation. He had joined the Ford assembly line at the age of 22. He had retired 30 years later, with ruined knees, a gold watch bought with contributions from his colleagues, and an unwavering conviction that honest work was the only currency that did not depreciate. Dorothy had been his wife for 26 years. She had died of cancer in 1978, 3 years before this story. The neighborhood hospital where she was treated lacked the necessary equipment. The funds to acquire them had been requested by the medical administration twice in 2 years. Twice, the city hall's response was the same: no resources available. James was not a political man. He wasn't an activist. He didn't sign manifestos or attend neighborhood meetings. He was the kind of man you'd only notice by his absence. When he was gone, things simply weren't going so well. But there was one thing James Whitmore was incapable of doing: to ignore an injustice when it was right before your eyes. In November 1981, James Whitmore lived alone in that apartment. And it was there on a cold Thursday night that it all began. It was an ordinary Thursday. James had returned from the grocery store with 2 shopping bags when he saw the envelope. It was under the door of 4B. There was no name. There was no return address. A plain brown envelope, the kind you buy at any stationery store for a few cents, carefully placed on the floor. Not thrown, placed. James picked it up. He looked both ways down the hallway. Silence. He carried the groceries upstairs. He put the water on to boil. He sat down at the table, and then he opened the envelope. Inside there were photographs, photocopies, financial spreadsheets covered in numbers that, to most people, would mean nothing. But James had spent 30 years tracking Ford's numbers. He knew what a spreadsheet should look like when the numbers were honest, and what he was seeing wasn't honest. The Detroit city government had claimed for 2 consecutive years that it didn't have enough funds to renovate the schools in the South Borough. Leaks, cracked walls, bathrooms without doors. The children went anyway because they had no choice. And the official answer was always the same: no money. The documents in the envelope told a different story. In a closed session, therefore without public access, without transparent voting, The municipal administration had approved a contract worth $4,300,000 with a consulting firm registered in the Cayman Islands, an offshore jurisdiction, a tax haven. The company had no verifiable address on American soil. It had no publicly identified employees. In practice, it had no real existence beyond a registration number on a distant piece of paper. $4,300,000 for a company that didn't exist while the children studied under leaky roofs. James spent the entire night reading, rereading, checking every number, every date, every signature. His daughter Ruth called 3 times. He didn't answer. At 4 in the morning, he put the documents on the table, went to the window, and stood looking out at Detroit. At that moment, at the window, James had a choice. He could fold the documents, put them back in the envelope, and throw them away. You'd tell yourself it wasn't your problem, that there were people more capable of handling it, that he was a 52-year-old retiree with bad knees and a daughter to protect. This path was reasonable. It was safe. It was the path most people would have taken, not out of cowardice, but out of prudence. Out of love for the people who depended on them. James looked at the city, and he thought of Dorothy. She had died without proper treatment because the hospital lacked resources. Resources that had been requested. Resources that existed, that were there, in spreadsheets, in shell accounts, in tax havens, but that never arrived. James returned to the table. He began to organize the documents. I had made a decision. The next morning, James woke up at 6. He made black coffee, without sugar. He always did that. And he went to the cupboard. The gray wool coat had been knitted by Dorothy in the winter of 1974. It was old. It had a hole in the elbow that he never had repaired. It was the coat he wore when he needed to face something difficult. He put the documents in a folder. He left the house. Years later, Ruth would describe that morning. My father wasn't impulsive. He never was. When he did something, he had already thought everything through beforehand. So when I learned that he had left that morning with that briefcase, I knew, without knowing what was inside, that he wasn't going to change his mind. That's how he was. That's how my mother had taught him to be. The Detroit Free Press occupied a 6-story building in the city center. On a Thursday morning in November, Sandra Kowalski was at her desk reviewing a story about irregularities in the state healthcare system. Sandra was 34 years old, daughter of Polish immigrants, granddaughter of miners who had arrived in America holding a promise in both hands. She had chosen investigative journalism because someone needed to hold those promises to account, and that someone, in her view, could very well be her. The security guard at the entrance called the intercom. There was a man in the lobby, a retired Ford employee. He had a briefcase. He said he had information about the city hall. Sandra knew this type. They showed up every week, people with theories, resentments, distorted versions of personal events packaged as public denunciations. She was about to tell them to go away, but something made her hesitate. Perhaps the security guard's tone of voice, perhaps the intuition that develops after years of hearing true stories and distinguishing them from false ones. She went downstairs. In an interview given years later, Sandra described that encounter. What impressed me wasn't just what he brought, although what he brought was extraordinary. It was the way he spoke. No anger, no drama, no need to be seen as a hero. It was like a man giving a technical report. Facts, numbers, dates. And at the end, he looked at me and said, "I don't know what you're going to do with this." But someone needed to know. Sandra spent the next 72 hours checking every detail of what James had brought. Corporate law experts, accountants, a former City Hall employee who had resigned 6 months earlier for reasons that turned out to be far less personal than they had seemed. Every document was verified. Every number matched. And there was more. As she pulled the threads, others appeared. The phantom contract was only what was visible on the surface. Beneath it lay a network. Payments, favors, votes orchestrated in sessions that should, by law, have been open to the public. $4,300,000 had disappeared. And with them, everything they were supposed to have financed. The editor read without saying a word. Then he looked at her. "Are you sure about all of this?" "Every line," she replied. "Then make room on the front page." Before publishing, Sandra needed to have a conversation with James about protection. She could keep the source's identity secret. It was standard practice in investigative journalism, and she had done it dozens of times. But she needed to be honest. Given the volume and specificity of the information, the people involved in the scheme would likely find out the source anyway. Anonymity could be a false protection. James listened to everything, silently, with the same attention he had used to read the documents in the envelope, without haste, without interruption. Then he said, "Put my name on it, and my picture if you want. I didn't do anything that needs shading." The story came out on a Thursday. Page 1 above the fold. Photo of James Whitmore next to reproduced copies of the most incriminating documents. $4 million in shadow. City government diverts funds while schools collapse. In less than 24 hours, Detroit woke up in a different way. It wasn't the violent awakening the city had known before. It was the awakening of conversations, neighbors looking at each other for the first time in months, unemployed workers finding a name for what they felt, churches transforming sermons into assemblies. The city hall remained silent for 48 hours. 48 hours without a statement, no denial, no spokesperson. Any experienced reporter knows what this silence means. The retaliation began on the third day after the publication. First, it was the tires, all 4 of them punctured on the same night. Then the car windows. Then the mailbox in front of the building, set on fire at 2 in the morning. No one has claimed responsibility for the crime. No one has been identified. The police have opened incident reports, filed away. Ruth's youngest grandson, 9 years old, began to be bullied at school. Ruth went to the principal. The principal promised to investigate. The bullying continued. James's retired colleagues received calls. The message was clear. Supporting the old man would be costly professionally. Ruth called every morning. Her voice grew increasingly tense, her words increasingly careful not to sound like a plea for him to stop, but sounding exactly that. In one of those calls, she finally said it directly. "Dad, they're going to hurt you." James remained silent for a long moment. Then he replied, "They're already hurting everyone, Ruth. The difference is that now they know someone is watching." It was on a night of heavy rain that James knocked on Eleanor Voss's door. Eleanor was 61 years old. She had spent 2 decades as a public prosecutor and another 5 years as a civil rights advocate before opening her own office, where she took on cases that nobody else wanted because there was no money involved. People said she had lost faith in the system. She corrected this interpretation with surgical precision. "I didn't lose faith in the system. I lost faith in the people who kidnapped him." Those are very different things. She opened the door, looked at him standing in the rain, and said, "Come in, the coffee's hot." James told everything. The documents, the story, the retaliation, the tires, the mailbox, Ruth, the grandson. Eleanor listened to the end. She stared at the coffee for a long moment. Then he picked up the notepad. What public history rarely tells, what headlines and verdicts fail to reveal, is what happens at midnight, when courage begins to weigh heavily. There was one night in particular, 15 days after the publication. The retaliation was at its peak. Ruth had called crying. Her grandson had arrived home with his uniform torn. James went into the living room. He sat in Dorothy's rocking chair, the one by the window, the one he rarely used because it was hers, and sitting in it still hurt in a way that defied description. And he stayed there, in silence, for hours. Ruth recounted many years later that she had driven by that night and seen the light on. She parked across the street and stared out the window for a long time. "I saw his shadow in my mother's chair," she said. "And I kept thinking, if he's going to give up, it's going to be tonight. And if it's tonight, I understand."
God forgive me, but I understand.
In Dorothy's final days, when she could barely speak, she took James's hand and whispered a phrase. James never repeated it in public, but Ruth knew it. Her mother had said the same phrase to her in a conversation that Ruth kept for decades. "Don't let them erase you." That night, at 12:40 a.m., James called Eleanor. "Eleanor," he said, "tomorrow morning, are you still with me?" She replied in a hoarse voice as if she had been woken from sleep. "James, I never left." What James didn't know was that he had done something no one else had managed to do. Go first. A City Hall secretary had kept copies of compromising emails in a folder at home for 2 years, not knowing what to do with them. An accountant had been pressured to sign reports with altered numbers. A junior city councilor had voted against the contracts and been politically isolated as punishment. None of them had spoken, not out of cowardice, but because there was no James. There was no one who had gone first and was still standing to prove that it was possible. Now there was, and they started calling. The process lasted 18 months. 18 months of audits, depositions, and technical arguments that stretched for hours on legal definitions that most people will never need to know. The defense lawyers tried to discredit the sources, question the chain of custody of the documents, and delay each hearing with procedural appeals. Eleanor constructed the case with the patience of a watchmaker. Each piece in its right place, in the right order. She knew that haste was gifted ammunition to the opposing side. Sandra continued publishing, every week a new article. New details, new sources. The map of the scheme was becoming progressively clearer, more documented, more irrefutable. In the 12th month, the assistant mayor responsible for contracts resigned. The statement cited personal and health reasons. Nobody believed it. 2 city councilors were indicted. The offshore company was investigated by federal authorities. The digital money trail, every transfer, every intermediary account, every fee was there, waiting. The final verdict came out on a Tuesday in March. James was sitting in the second row, next to Ruth and the children. Eleanor was at the lawyer's table, with her back to them. Guilty, 7 out of 9 charges.
James didn't celebrate. He didn't cry. He didn't hug anyone immediately. He closed his eyes.
He took a deep breath. He opened his eyes. Outside, a reporter who had been covering the case since the first story approached with a microphone. Mr. Whitmore, how are you feeling? I feel like an American, like I always have. It's just that today people saw that too. The recovered money was redirected, not all of it. It's never all of it. But enough to make a difference in the right places. 3 schools in the southern neighborhood were renovated, roofs repaired, walls painted, bathrooms with doors. James went to the opening. He stood on the sidewalk for a long time. Ruth said it was the only time in all those years that she had seen her father cry. Sandra Kowalski won the Michigan State Journalism Award for that series of reports. In every interview she gave in the following decades, she began with the same sentence. There is a man named James Whitmore who taught me what courage is. Not the courage from the movies. Real courage, the kind that appears at 2 in the morning, when the mailbox is on fire and you still decide not to move. Eleanor Voss retired in 1990 and wrote a memoir. She dedicated the chapter on the Whitmore case to, and I quote, all the Jameses in the world. Those who remained silent for too long and one day decided that enough was enough. Ruth Whitmore became a primary school teacher. She said she had chosen the profession because of her grandmother Dorothy, and that every day when she entered the classroom, she thought of them both. James Earl Whitmore lived for another 15 years. He died in September 1996 of cardiac arrest while sleeping. Ruth said he had a smile on his face. Every great nation has 2 histories, the one that is recounted in the monuments. And what happens at 2 in the morning, when nobody's looking, and someone decides to act that way anyway? This is the America that rarely appears on camera, the one that is built by ordinary people. That at unusual times. They refuse to remain silent, in memory of all who came before.